¿Cómo están todos? Buenos días. Yo soy Camila Corderford, seguro han recibido algún correo mío. Soy la directora general de Luminario, y Luminario es una nueva asociación sin fines de lucro dedicada a la educación. En Luminario estamos desarrollando un proyecto de acompañamiento pedagógico para apoyar a los docentes de inicial, justamente en mejorar la calidad de su interacción y así fomentar el desarrollo del lenguaje en los niños. Y hoy día estamos haciendo nuestro primer seminario. Parte de nuestros esfuerzos es poder traer a expertos para que bueno, no toda, porque acá hay 100, pero los que puedan venir a escucharla. Nosotros creemos plenamente en la importancia de la cooperación, porque hay tantas iniciativas de educación que la única manera que lo vamos a poder mejorar el futuro de las futuras familias de Perú es a través de la colaboración. Entonces, nuestro primer seminario hemos traído a la doctora Catherine Snow, y espero que les interese. Bueno, ya la va a presentar Armida. Armida va a presentar a Catherine Snow. Armida es la coordinadora de Perú para la red de ProLeer, y ProLeer es una red a lo largo de las Américas y con unos par de países en Europa, también dedicado a la educación de los niños y el desarrollo del lenguaje. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días a todos, gracias por estar aquí. Mi nombre es Armida Lizárraga, yo soy la coordinadora de Perú para ProLeer, una red de investigadores, profesionales y creadores de políticas públicas educativas que se reúnen una vez al año en la Universidad de Harvard, con el fin de compartir conocimientos y crear redes de colaboración entre organizaciones que trabajan en primera infancia, en Latinoamérica y también en Holanda. Esta red nació de forma orgánica, con reuniones informales, convocadas por Catherine Snow desde el año 2008. Pero ProLeer es solo un ejemplo de su profesionalidad y su manera humana de trabajar. El trabajo de Catherine es referente para los estudiosos del desarrollo del lenguaje y también para los profesionales de la educación. Los principales temas de su investigación son el contexto social del desarrollo del lenguaje y las condiciones que más contribuyen al desarrollo de la literacidad, así como las habilidades de razonamiento en aulas del nivel inicial y primario. Su trabajo es centrado en la investigación educativa conectada a los problemas de la práctica diaria en el aula. Este interés nace de una mente sumamente curiosa y atenta a los otros y al uso del lenguaje como medio social. Tuve el lujo de poder trabajar con Catherine y compartir el mismo espacio de trabajo profesional. Ella siempre era de las primeras en el tercer piso de Larsen Hall, y a esa hora nuestras cortas conversaciones eran de temas como la extinción de algunos idiomas, sus clases de árabe o chino, e incluso de fútbol, pues éramos las únicas que seguíamos la Copa o el Mundial. Catherine es una acérrima hincha del equipo holandés. Lo que es impresionante es su brillantez y dedicación a hacer investigación relevante para mejorar el aprendizaje de los niños. Su energía es infatigable. Catherine es un referente. Siempre que estoy en alguna reunión con algún dilema educativo, me pregunto, ¿qué haría Catherine Snow? Gracias por estar aquí. Es un honor. Bienvenida, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Armida, for that very generous introduction. It's nice to get back together with some of the people from the third floor of Larsen in faraway places in 2017, not 2016. Sorry, apologize. I haven't quite made the full transition, as you see, to the new era. I think it's wishful thinking. I wish I were back before the previous elections in the US. Let me start by saying that I will try to talk very slowly for the benefit of the interpreter and those of you who are listening without interpretation. But if I start going too fast, as I might do because I tend to talk very fast, please wave your arms or something, do something notable so I will slow down. And in collaboration with Armida, we decided on this topic, what is really hard about learning to read, as one that seemed most important to start with, at least, in developing this conversation that I hope will continue over many years to come among early childhood educators in Peru. So maybe first it makes sense to just ask the question, why do we care so much about reading when we're thinking about children who are 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds and not yet reading, not yet being subjected to formal instruction in reading? And my answer to that is because ultimately literacy skills, reading, writing, but also speaking in ways that are informed by the ability to read and write. Those skills are the most important thing a child can learn. Math is very important. There are lots of other important things as well, but literacy is really the central, the key, what opens the door to multiple other domains of reading. And children who don't know how to read well by the end of their first year of formal schooling are very likely to fail, to struggle, to be demoralized, to drop out, to end up not contributing to society as we would hope they might. So, of course, we want to start early. We want to start at birth, preparing children for success in this domain of literacy. And we need to think about this in particular in countries like the US, and I infer Peru, where there are very large social class differences. Because if we continue to promote literacy success only for the relatively rich, the relatively privileged, then we're contributing to a breakdown of civil society. So let me start by saying that I'm very much giving you a perspective from North America, and I hope you will, in the questions and the discussion, feel free to reinterpret and challenge this with the data and information that you have about the situation in Peru, because I don't expect that all of the lessons from North America will be directly transferable, but it is clear that we have made some really informative mistakes in our early childhood policies in North America. And it would be really lovely if you guys could just skip those mistakes and move on directly to the better solutions. You know, like in Africa, they've decided not to put up telephone lines and just go directly to cell phones. Well, that's the kind of metaphor it would be useful to take on. Let's skip the old-fashioned infrastructure and move directly to a better set of solutions. So, okay, as the poster for the literacy programs in the Soviet Union in 1920 emphasized, an illiterate is like a blind man, and so we do need to think about how to promote literacy universally in society. So let me start by showing you a little bit of data. I promise not to try not to overwhelm you with data, but these are, I think, particularly informative data. These are scores on a variety of literacy assessments for children in 1st through 6th grade in the US. 1st grade, these are 6-year-olds just starting to learn to read. 6th graders, they're about 12, and they should, by this point, have achieved norms, 50th percentile on tests of reading comprehension, which is really the big reading challenge, comprehending what you read, being able to learn from what you read. And what you see here is the yellow bars are scores of from this group of very low SES kids, Spanish, English bilinguals from families with very low education and very few financial resources, the most at-risk children in the American education system. And in 1st grade, they're scoring above the 50th percentile on average in decoding. They know how to read words. Reading words is not the problem. And they continue across the grades through 6th grade, reading above the 50th percentile, if they're just reading words. But starting from the very beginning, you see the red bar, vocabulary, They're very, very low. Well, of course, they're still learning English. Their English vocabulary is limited. That's not too surprising. But it's a portent of things to come, unfortunately. Now, the green bar there in first grade is reading comprehension. Well, reading comprehension in first grade is not a very challenging task. It's something like find the picture that matches the cat is under the table. Because we aren't yet really talking about comprehension the way we think about it for older children. Reading long texts, learning what's in the text, analyzing what's in the text, perhaps reading two texts and putting the information together to draw some inferences. That's what we as adults mean by reading comprehension. That's what we'd like students in Seminario to be able to do. But we can't do that with first graders because they just don't read well enough yet. So as first graders and second graders, these kids score pretty well on comprehension, on those simple comprehension tests. As they get into third grade, they're at below the 20th percentile on listening comprehension. They're not understanding a lot of what they hear. They're still very low on vocabulary. And their reading comprehension scores are coming down. By fifth grade, they're below the 20th percentile, on average, in vocabulary, in listening comprehension, and in reading comprehension, and in sixth grade. And that's exactly where these students stay through their schooling. So what's hard about learning to read? It's evidently not learning to read words. It's learning to read texts. It's learning how to process texts in ways that enable you to learn and analyze and integrate and critique and evaluate and think about those texts. What are the key elements that some children get access to, children in highly educated families, children in families where there are lots of books around, children in families that go to museums and take the kids on trips and talk to them when they're having dinner together. How do we give all children access to the learning that comes from those experiences? So this is a pretty standard finding that educationally at-risk children learn to decode pretty well. And those were data from English. It's so much easier to learn to decode in Spanish, right? That's clearly not the problem. But they continue to struggle with word reading. So what happens in early childhood programs, in EC programs in the US, programs particularly focused on these educationally at-risk children? Well, I'm sorry to tell you that what happens all too often is a lot of time spent learning the alphabet. Not a bad thing, it's good to know. A lot of time spent tracing letters, a lot of time spent doing letter recognition drills, a lot of time spent doing phonological awareness drills. Let's think of a word that rhymes with dog. Can you think of another word that begins with D? Well, those are okay things to do. There's nothing wrong with that, if there are other things going on as well. But if that's the only thing that's going on, then children are just being over-prepared to do well on decoding, which is what they're going to do well on anyway. Right? And they're not getting access to lots of alternative enrichment activities that actually would focus on those domains where they're likely to struggle. So these are fine practices in their place, but their place should be very limited. We have very good experimental evidence about phonological awareness training, for example, that 20 minutes a day for 8 weeks gets kids as far as they're going to go, right? It's useful, it's helpful, 20 minutes a day for 8 weeks, but an hour a day for 3 years of preschool, waste of time, time that could much better be spent doing other things. So here's one model that I think is quite informative. This was developed and sketched out by a researcher named Hollis Scarborough. And it's 15 years, 14, it's old now, but it's still very useful. And it shows the way in which a whole array of different skills have to be wound together, integrated, woven together in order to produce what we want at the end: skilled reading, fluent coordination of knowledge and language and decoding skills in order to produce real text comprehension. And this word recognition part of it, the skinny strand at the bottom, it's very important. I don't want to suggest it's not important. I just want to suggest that it's less time-consuming and less a domain of risk than we often think. And one thing that happened in US education policy was the hypothesis that kids fail in comprehension because of failure in word recognition. And so huge policy efforts were undertaken to improve the teaching of word recognition. And indeed, the kids got better at word recognition. And it didn't do a bloody bit of good improving comprehension, because word recognition was never really the big problem. Big pressures on early childhood programs serving low-income children to prevent and remediate vocabulary gaps. And that's no doubt a good thing. I'm sort of in favor of that, within limits, but I think we have to think about it very carefully. Because, for one thing, most early childhood programs begin at 3 or 4, well after this gap is established. So it's going to be hard to close the existing gap, and we might think about preventing the gap. Furthermore, it leads in some cases to rather didactic approaches, like, okay, here are our 15 vocabulary words for the week. Right? 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds don't do well with didactic instruction of that type. They really don't learn that way. And furthermore, and most crucially, the vocabulary scores, I would argue, are not really the problem. The vocabulary scores are indicators of the problem. It's like taking a temperature, right? The vocabulary score is the thermometer taking the temperature of the child. It's not, you don't change the underlying issue by putting the thermometer in cold water, right? The underlying issue remains, and the underlying issue is, in fact, the knowledge gap, right? So I'm arguing that we need to that it would be wonderful to kind of jump over this monolithic focus on vocabulary as the thing to fix and think about what is vocabulary good for and where does vocabulary come from. And that means switching figure for ground here. Can everybody see that those are figure ground alternatives, but switching figure for ground and thinking about this 30 million word gap as an Encyclopedia Britannica's worth of knowledge gap. The big difference is how much kids know, not how many words they know. So if we talk about it as a knowledge gap, then I think we reorient what we focus on in early childhood programs, and in elementary programs for that matter, in productive and useful ways. So the social class differences are there, but vocabulary is the index, and the question is, what is it indexing? Well, it's indexing differences among families, among children, in opportunities to be talked to about things that matter and that build their knowledge stores. But the kind of key element here, from my point of view, is this. She's getting the kids to identify the zorro chilote, and then she says, ¿saben ustedes por qué los zorros están o han estado en peligro de extinción? This is vocabulary, and it's knowledge. It's important facts about the world. Porque antiguamente habían cazadores que lo cazaban, and then las damas elegantes, right? A nice construct to introduce into the lives of these kids. And do you know what they eat? Not que comen, pero de qué se alimentan. son carnívoros, right? So the merging here of knowledge and vocabulary is kind of a classic example of how to do this well. And I will tell you a very sad story. This video, which I wish you could have seen, was collected in one of the several hundred classrooms in Chile where we were doing an experiment. We did professional development with the teachers, and we taught them rather specific procedures borrowed from successful American classrooms for teaching vocabulary, in which you read a book and then you pick interesting words out of the book and teach those words. And that is a successful practice in US classrooms. And in Chilean classrooms, it didn't relate at all to children's growth in vocabulary. It was this kind of teaching, which the teachers were doing because it was part of their curriculum, that was the best predictor of children's vocabulary growth. And sadly enough, in the classrooms where we taught them to do our form of vocabulary teaching, they did less of this. So our intervention was counterproductive because we hadn't done enough work to figure out what was really successful in the sort of natural pedagogical practices. So I would argue that effective vocabulary teaching kind of demotes vocabulary and promotes knowledge, and embeds vocabulary and knowledge, attends to the need to use sophisticated vocabulary, but in the context of teaching about things that kids are actually interested in and that teachers are actually interested in, and that become important in sort of shared knowledge domains. So one reason I mention this is because reading aloud or talking about these topics is the key feature for doing this, the key practice. But I'll get back to reading aloud in a minute. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about one of the pieces of research of the last 10 years that I think is most striking in this domain of early childhood and most important to pay attention to. It was a monograph produced by a woman named Michelle Chouinard, who analyzed transcripts of mother-child or parent-child interaction from about 7 kids, mostly middle-class kids. And all she did was she went through these transcriptions of parent-child interactions, parent-child conversations, and she discovered that kids between the ages of 12 months and 60 months ask about 100 questions an hour when they are with their parents. That's more than one a minute. And if you've had a conversation recently with a 3-year-old, you might recognize this phenomenon. Like, what's this? It's why is it called that? Well, because, why? But why? But where did it come from? But where? But how do we know? But, right? I mean, the kids are insatiably curious. And thus they ask a lot of questions and they sort of drive us crazy. But so if you just add this up, I mean, just do a little figuring in your head. If they're asking 300 questions a day, let's say, they're with their parents for 3 hours, maybe, an hour in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon. That might be an overestimate, it might be an underestimate, but take it for what it is, it's just a guess. That's 900 questions a day times 365 days, 300,028 questions a year, times 4 years. That's 1.3 million questions before they get into preschool. Now imagine if just half of those are answered, how much they've managed to learn. And what's crucial about this is that this is the stuff that kids really are going to learn because this is what they themselves are interested in, right? This isn't a curriculum from out there telling the kids they've got to learn this stuff. This is what they want to know about. And those are the conditions for young children under which they are most likely to learn, most likely to acquire the vocabulary to talk about these topics. So what are those questions? Well, the 60 to 70% of them across the children she studied were information-seeking questions. What, how, why? There are other kinds of questions like, can I have a cookie? But let's forget those. The 3/4 are information-seeking. And in these families, at least, across this age range, about 3/4 of them receive a response. So there's a lot of opportunity to learn here. And if they don't receive a response, then kids will ask them again, which is good evidence that they're not just asking for attention. They're actually asking for information, right? Little children are knowledge-seeking devices. They're running around the world trying to learn stuff. And adults are the primary resource to help them learn. They're not yet in a position to go to the library and sit down and look things up. They've got to ask adults, and adults are the ones who have to help them learn. So they repeat these questions if they haven't gotten a response, and kids almost never repeat their statements. The percentage of questions repeated versus the percentage of statements repeated, the dark black bars, very, very different. Again, evidence that they're really curious. They really want to know. So what's our responsibility as adults in homes and in classrooms? It's to at least answer some of those questions, right? Try to figure out how to respond to children's interests. So what do they ask about? Well, this is, I think, an under-researched area, and it's certainly the case that kids in different cultures, in different societies, in different families will ask about different things. I think whatever it is, it's something worth attending to. I think I would really love to know what kids are asking about and how different that is across different kids. But what I see here is that this is a plea that kids are desperately asking for content in early childhood classrooms. They're desperately asking for information that might respond to their interests. So then the question is, okay, what kind of content? What do we want to tell them about in early childhood classrooms? How do we anticipate their knowledge needs? Because after all, it's not one-on-one. If you've got one child, you can follow that child's curiosity. But if you've got 15 or 20 or 25, you've got to figure out something that many of them will be curious about. And this is all, I'm just sort of fantasizing here. So one way you might think about what do you want to teach kids about at age 4 is, well, what are they going to need to know at age 10? Right? So let's start to teach them about the things they will be expected to read about 6 years later, because background knowledge in those domains will help them read better. We know that a major predictor of reading comprehension is background knowledge about the topic. So in American schools, in 4th grade, kids might read about any of these topics. They might be expected to read about, nutrition, vitamins, carbohydrates, about social structures, towns and cities and nations. They might be expected to read about transportation, the steam engine and the steamboat. And there are lots of topics they might be expected to read about. And you could say, well, this is a pretty boring early childhood curriculum here. This is not really what we want to do in early childhood. So I ask you then to think about, from the child's point of view, what are a lot of 4-year-olds interested in? What do 4-year-olds like to talk about? Pokemon. Okay, great. Nature. Castles, princesses, dinosaurs, zombies. Good one. Lots of potential in zombies, yeah. There are some topics that we know kids are curious about, some percentage of kids. And I think those topics could be an outline for, or a repertoire, a set of options for topics in early childhood. Superheroes, you might think superheroes not important, but superheroes have a potential for doing lots of science, right? You might think holidays and foods are kind of sort of low level, but in fact they can be an entree to talking about history, to talking about chemistry. Each one of these topics, in a sense, maps onto an adult domain of serious scholarship. So I'm certainly not suggesting that we introduce a unit in 4-year-old classrooms called paleontology. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that if kids are interested in fossils, we can give them a chance to learn a lot about fossils, and they will automatically be learning about paleontology. They will be preparing themselves for reading about paleontology. I'm not suggesting we introduce political science in 4-year-old classrooms, but if the kids really want to talk about conflicts between superheroes with different strengths, that can become a conversation about advantages and disadvantages and the ways in which conflicts emerge and can be resolved, which I see as the basis of political science. So there are lots of ways here in which we could cleverly prepare children for the domains of knowledge they will need, at the same time responding to the domains of curiosity that they have. Because if we're doing it only from the right-hand side to the left, then we're just boring them to death. We have to meet them in the middle between what they're interested in and what we know they will need to learn. So basically, upper middle class, privileged children from highly educated families, they learn this stuff, right? They learn it because they go to pre-K classrooms with good curricula, with more content, or they learn it because they've had lots of dinner table conversations with their parents about these topics, or they learn it because they've been read to a lot. And being read aloud to is one key element here. It's a particularly powerful practice for expanding children's knowledge. Huge amount of evidence, research evidence on this. The consequences of parent-child book reading for cognition, for learning about print, for learning about how to handle books, which is important, for acquiring language, and also, of course, for moral development, for learning some important lessons about how to get along in the world. But let me focus here on the cognition and language piece of this, because I think they are the domains in which some children are particularly needy. I do a lot of work with a colleague at Harvard named Bob Selman, who does work on moral development. We work together on early childhood curricula, in which he's always trying to promote moral development with the activities we're engaged in. And I say, well, Bob, it's fine, I don't know. I don't care if the kids end up moral or not, as long as they learn how to read. And he says, Catherine, I don't care if they learn how to read, as long as they end up moral. And the fact of the matter is, I think as hard as it is to ensure that they're going to learn how to read, that's easier than the other thing. So I've got the easier part of this task. But let's look at just a couple of examples of what goes on in parent-child interaction around books. La oruga muy hambrienta is a classic of these are data from very, very poor families, from families in a welfare reform experiment, a study that we did a long time ago now. And the mother is reading this book with the child. And the child's approach basically is to repeat everything the mother says. Right? So he built a small house, called a cocoon around himself. He stayed inside. You all know this book, I'm sure. So that he nibbled a hole in the cocoon, pushed his way out, and he was a beautiful butterfly. And so the mother says, what the cocoon turn into? I mean, what do caterpillars turn to? And the child said, butterflies. And they said, right, what do they live in? A butterfly house. And this, pointing to the cocoon. What's that called? A cocoon, right? So here's a little episode of learning about metamorphosis in that, a conversation that would never happen without the book. Right? I mean, it's not that this is such a crucial, particularly crucial conversation. The point is that conversations like this, these topics, these words, they get introduced, they get supported, they get scaffolded by the presence of the book. And that's why book reading and talking about the books is so important. Another example, also reading Very Hungry Caterpillar. What's that? Pointing to the picture of the sun. What's that? What make you hot? I don't know. What make you hot? The sun don't make you hot? It make you real hot, right? So again, a little bit of world knowledge linked to fairly simple vocabulary in this case, but a topic that probably wouldn't come up without the presence of the book. Reading a more informational book. This is a slightly older child, a child almost 6. The mother says, that's a tusk, see? It's white. You know what? Hunters kill these elephants for that. Why? Because they use it for different things. Museums buy them. I don't know about museums, but I know they kill for this white. There's no tusk on these elephants, though, the kid says. Mom says, see, that one's bigger, so some of them die because of that. That's sad. Kid, I wish there was not such things as hunters and guns. Mom, I know, me too. Oh, there's a herd. There's a lot of them. See how they walk? Ma, here's one that's dead. I don't think he's dead. Well, we'll find out. And she reads, they use their tusks to dig. Oh, see, he's digging a hole. They use their tusks to dig for salt. Let's look and see if there's another page you might like. It's ivory. The tusks are made of ivory, and they can make things with these tusks. And that's why some animals, they die. The hunters kill them. No wonder why they have hunters. Yeah, that's sad. I'm never going to be a hunter when I grow up. So Bob Selman would like this. This is moral development. But again, it's a topic that's not going to come up at the dinner table, likely, or under normal circumstances. Maybe if you go to a museum, but book reading presents topics and vocabulary and ways of talking that go far beyond what's normally available to young kids. So book reading is really key. It's, of course, also key in building affective relationships. And it's one of the things kids like to do because it's an excuse to sit on mothers' laps. But unfortunately, research is very clear that book reading is much more common in middle-class families. However, the very good news is that the difference between middle-class and poor families in the way they talk is much, much smaller when they're reading books than in other contexts. Right? So books elevate the language interactions for everybody. And people talk more when they're reading books than when doing almost anything else. So it's a way of closing that 30 million word gap to do more book reading. But it's important to point out that it isn't just reading the book. In fact, reading the book is perhaps the least important part of it. It's talking about the content of the book. It's talking about the pictures. It's talking about the information in the text. And it's rereading books that generates long-term learning. The first time through, kids can learn something, but the 10th time through, will have learned a lot more. And this is one of the reasons, it's like the questions that kids are asking all the time when they're 3. They drive you crazy, but they're really important for long-term learning. Well, reading a book for the 10th time might drive you crazy as a parent, but it's the passage through the book that enables children to really go deep with the knowledge. So, of course, there's a lot of research to be done in culturally appropriate, language appropriate styles of book reading. And I'm not suggesting that these particular conversations that I've shown here are the model. They are a model for how this can be particularly helpful. I'm happy, by the way, to make this PowerPoint available, so if people want to look for these articles, you can get the references. So ultimately, what I'm arguing here is that we need to inject more knowledge into early childhood classrooms. We need to figure out what mechanisms are available to help us focus more on making knowledge available. And I think one approach is to support the adults in those classrooms with more materials and more ideas about how to do this. What is, in effect, a curriculum that, well, when curricula get introduced in early childhood classrooms in the US, the focus is often on, let's make it very familiar to the children. Let's talk about home. Let's talk about the classroom. Let's talk about pets. And, you know, I don't want to scare kids. I don't want to overly challenge kids, but they already know about homes. They already know about their classroom. They already know about their pets. I would argue we should be moving beyond these sort of banal topics that kids have access to. I have seen hour-long lessons in early childhood classrooms about your favorite pizza topping. Now, this is not a generative topic, you know? Kids might like to talk about salami versus onions, but there's nothing to learn there. We have to use this time very, very cautiously to make sure that kids are being talked to about things that will really help them learn in the long run. So introducing topics related to child interests with books to support the learning, and what that means, of course, is having rich resources available, having libraries, having access to online materials, having supports for teachers, because we can't expect early childhood teachers to know the answers to all those million questions that kids might ask. But thinking constantly about, is this important knowledge? Is this rich conceptual knowledge? And will kids be able to benefit from learning about these topics? The early childhood field is really plagued by some false dichotomies. And one of the false dichotomies is this play versus learning. Should the kids be learning or should they be playing? Well, they are learning when they're playing, if the play is structured and supported in useful ways. They're probably not learning if there's no playfulness involved. So it's the proper deployment of playful activities and focusing them on learning that is crucial. And the false dichotomy of curiosity versus curriculum. Well, it can be a real dichotomy if we're imposing a curriculum, but a curriculum can be responsive to children's curiosity, in which case we have the opportunity for the very best of all possible worlds. So I'm basically a developmental psychologist. I think it's important to bring science into this conversation, and the science has, as I hope I've demonstrated, informed us about some of the key processes in development, the children's curiosity, their search for knowledge. And at the same time, we have scientific approaches to generating practical knowledge. We really do we don't know everything about what the best practices are. And one thing scientists can help us do is evaluate alternative approaches. But a key step in all of this for all of us interested in doing a better job is leveraging the knowledge we have to make arguments to those in positions of power about the importance of these ideas. And there's a lot of support, I think, now from the international community in doing that. That link there is to a report that makes a very, very strong case, the UNICEF report that makes a very strong case for the value of early childhood education, the value of investing in high-quality early childhood education, and the identification of a few key features of quality in early childhood education, specifically stimulating interactions between adults and children, and the effective use of curriculum. Coaching and mentoring for teachers, of course, to support them in doing that, but the key elements inside the classroom are warm and stimulating relationships and rich curriculum. So here are the guiding principles I would close with, that children do learn on their own, but they learn a lot more with support from others. Of course, they should be exploring, but they should also be guided so that those explorations are the most productive they can be. Building on children's play, on their interests, on their curiosity is the best basis for efficient learning. So here's the final little set of hopeful elements. Interaction with stimulating and supportive adults. Children should all have this opportunity. They should all have the opportunity for playful, creative, collaborative, content-rich activities, book-mediated, cognitively challenging activities, meaningful and engaging curriculum content to support teachers in supporting students. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we have lots of conversation and discussion.
Ahora yo veo a las madres, por ejemplo, en las consultas de los médicos, ella con su iPad y el niño con su juego electrónico.
Clearly, we are reducing the amount of parent-child interaction because of the intervention of so many screens.
Acerca de los niños que son prelingüistas. O sea, ¿cómo se podría reconocer y cómo se podría abordar las preguntas de los niños antes de que hablen, ¿no? Antes de que se comuniquen verbalmente, porque se están comunicando de otras maneras, ¿no?
Children who gesture a lot, children who point a lot, are children who will learn to talk sooner than children who don't point. Presumably because when kids point, then parents can talk about what they're pointing at, right? So they're asking questions, in effect, by pointing, indicating what they're interested in. And that is a nonverbal, a pre-linguistic form of expressing curiosity. But it requires parents who are attentive to what children are looking at, what they're pointing at, what they're picking up and manipulating. So there are many ways with children as young as 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, to be able to start to talk about things that they themselves are interested in by responding to their cues, to their non-linguistic cues.
Soy María Matsumura, directora general del CEPAL. Me voy a permitir hacer un comentario más que una pregunta. Lo que se tiene que cambiar es la mentalidad del profesor, y iniciativas de este tipo nos van a ayudar a entender que lo que el niño tiene que hacer es jugar y aprender a través de la interacción. Entonces, es eso, un comentario más que una pregunta directa.
No, it's a familiar observation. And it just raises one issue. I mean, of course, we're very much influencing teachers and curricula by virtue of what we decide to assess or to, so it's very important to think about assessing things that we really think are important, rather than assessing children on things that are like fine motor skills, which we know are not so important in literacy. But people will focus on them if they get assessed. Successful dyslexics are those who know a lot. Right? So dyslexics can read text even about topics that where they have rich background knowledge. As in first grade, second grade, as children are starting to show reading disabilities, that they not be forced to spend all their time being taught to decode. I mean, that obviously we can help them decode better. But at the same time, giving them access to being read aloud to, be listening to, watching National Geographic, watching the History Channel.
Las comunidades bilingües, nativas bilingües, donde la mayoría de los niños no acceden a la educación preescolar. ¿Cómo deberíamos iniciar la alfabetización en el primer grado
de estas comunidades o cómo lo hacen ustedes, por ejemplo, en el estado de Texas, donde hay muchos migrantes latinos, principalmente mexicanos? Gracias.
There is no deficit in English, ultimately, if they are taught to read first in Spanish, that they are more likely to remain bilingual if taught to read first in Spanish. So it's an additive situation rather than being, and I should say, part of this has to do with the fact that you can learn to read in Spanish much more quickly, and that learning to read in English before a fairly high level of oral language skill is achieved is very hard because of the deep orthography, the fact that all of the most common words are pronounced funny, right, are spelled funny. So it's particularly crucial in English that that children who don't speak the language not be forced to learn to read prematurely. Many succeed under those circumstances. A remarkable number succeed, but it very much increases the risk of failure. One question in all of this is, how much do we value the bilingualism? How much do we value the indigenous languages? Do we want to support them? If we want to support them, then providing literacy in those languages and providing mechanisms to stimulate parent-child interaction, learning interactions in the indigenous languages is really crucial. If we don't care about bilingualism, then it's not quite so crucial, quite frankly. And I mean, I say this, many immigrant families in the US, it's not the Mexican families on the border, but many immigrant families elsewhere in the country, they say, well, you know, that's fine. I just want my kid to speak English. I just want my kid to speak good English. I'm not going to bother to teach him my language. That's a choice that families have the right to make. I think it's sad. I mean, it's a waste, but it's their choice. But if they want to be bilingual, if they want their children to be bilingual, then very often parents are unrealistically optimistic, right? Oh, I speak Spanish, I'm sure my kids will speak Spanish. That is not likely to happen unless they make some very serious effort to ensure that it happen. And thus informing parents about the long-term consequences of their casual choices with young children is, I think, really crucially important.
Quisiera un poco, digamos, según su experiencia de investigación, ¿cuál es la edad promedio en la que el niño está preparado en su lenguaje expresivo para poder comenzar a aprender a leer y escribir de manera formal? Le hago un pequeño comentario muy pequeñito. Lo que pasa es que aquí en Perú hay un gran grueso de colegios, instituciones educativas en la que cada vez a más temprana edad comienzan a enseñar a leer y escribir, tal vez por la demanda de los padres de familia. Entonces yo creo que hay que ir más que nada a la función del niño y no en función del padre de familia. ¿Y cuál sería la edad promedio según el lenguaje expresivo ya desarrollado en un niño?
You know, what can I say? In England, kids go to school at 3, and fairly systematic literacy instruction starts at 3. And they do okay. In Finland, kids go to school at 7 and don't get systematic literacy instruction until 7.5. And they do fine too. They do even better, actually. So it's not as if there is a magic age. It's partly, this is partly a cultural phenomenon, sort of what do you expect children at different ages to do. My thinking about this is the following, that yes, you can teach a 3-year-old to read. It takes a lot of time and a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of energy on the part of the adult and on the part of the child. You can get the same learning if you start at 5 in half the time. So I'd rather be having interesting conversations with the 3-year-old. I'd rather be doing knowledge enrichment with the 3-year-old than wasting time teaching letters and sounds. But it's not, I can understand that parents think that's a good idea, and I think the message might be, it's a good idea for a little bit of time, right? We can't just tell them don't do that. They're not gonna buy it. But sort of, okay, 10 minutes a day, fine. But we will not spend, but we really need, there are all these other things that need to be attended to, the language, the knowledge, the curiosity, the questioning, and those take up a lot of time, and we need to make sure there's time for those. People might have heard of Vivian Gusson-Paley. Is her technique for doing this familiar to people? It's a wonderful technique. It's so much fun to watch kids do this. It's called SATA, storytelling, story acting. And basically, in an early childhood classroom, when it's activity time, one of the activities, the kids are over there doing blocks and over there doing painting, but one activity is the teacher sits down with a piece of paper, and any child can come and dictate a story. And the teacher transcribes the story, and maybe 2 or 3 kids do this you can limit it to 3 or 4 a day. And then later in the day, the child who's dictated the story gets to pick actors to act out the story. So everybody has there's a little theater, right? And Domingo, who's written a story about a frog eaten by a snake, gets to say, well, I want my friend Johnny to be the frog and my friend Charlie to be the snake. And the teacher reads the story, and Johnny comes out and eats Johnny, right? Takes 30 seconds, but the child is author, producer, director, talent scout, and over the course of a school year, this has been studied quite extensively in various classrooms. Over the course of a school year, the stories get longer, they get more complex, they get more interesting. And what very often happens with low language kids is they dictate a story and it gets acted out, and they say, no, wait a minute, that wasn't my story. Because they've thought of a very elaborate story, but they haven't actually told it. They've just got it in their heads. And then they realize when it gets acted out, reread and acted out, that they need to put their thoughts into words in ways that other people can access. It's a remarkably powerful little practice that can be implemented with no materials at all except paper and pencil. So I think it would be a wonderful thing to try out and see how it worked. It's also a very good social practice because it gets kids the opportunities to form reinforce friendships and alliances in the classroom. The woman is Vivian Gusson-Paley, P-A-L-E-Y. She is, I think, she must be retired by now, but she was a kindergarten teacher at the lab school at the University of Chicago, and she's written a series of books about her own practices as a kindergarten teacher.
Se debe trabajar mucho con los padres, porque los padres, la forma de medir es cuánto sabe su hijo. De pronto el niño está en un nido más abierto, de una educación más alternativa, y se mide con el otro niño que ya sabe leer y todas las letras y se siente inseguro. Entonces creo que sí es importante explicarle tanto a los profesores como a los papás la importancia de hacerlo de la otra manera.
Totalmente de acuerdo, sí.
Ok, y bueno, con eso hemos terminado.